Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now, hidden amongst a box of IDE cables and other PC parts was this little green graphics card. For just £2 at a car boot sale, I had to pick it up, and unfortunately it does have GDDR3 memory, and not only that, but it has just 2 gigs of this stuff, so I can't imagine how well it's going to do in 2024. Before I tell you exactly what this is, let me tell you about my installation experience. So this was pretty clean. I blew off a bit of the dust just with an air duster, and that was it really. Pretty good condition. I plugged it into my i5 12400F system, a fairly modern setup, and for some reason it completely broke it. The PC took about 10 minutes to get into the BIOS. The temperature reading of the CPU somehow was 0 degrees and the fan was top speed. I don't know what this card did to my PC, but after a couple of reboots everything was well, and I'd like to introduce you now to the R9255 OEM. Found in ASUS pre-builts, I'm assuming. This card, well, it wasn't fantastic at the time of its release, but in 2024 it's going to be even worse. With that said, however, I thought I'd test it out in 20 of my favourite games to see how well it does, so hopefully you can join me for the ride. And believe me, it's going to be a pretty bumpy one. So let's get into it and start with our first title. Now we're going to have to use a mix of resolutions here, and when I say a mix, I mean 90% of this video is going to be 720p gameplay, but we'll start off with Fallout 4. At the lowest settings here, we managed to scrape at least 30 FPS. Well, it was more than scrape actually. 44 FPS on average was pretty good in my opinion, and the 1% low was 35, the 0.1% vigor was 22, so a few dips and drops, especially in and around Diamond City, that sort of area downtown, but not too shabby, especially considering this probably dates back to around 2013. Next up we have Apex Legends, which is somewhat playable at 720p as well. Very low textures here with everything else set to lowest. We could have basically set 0 as the texture streaming budget, or none, I think the option is, but I stuck with very low. It does make things look a bit better. It doesn't affect performance all that much, and overall we saw 48 FPS with a 1% low of 33 and a 0.1% low of 30. So there we are. I could have used dynamic resolution as well, or adaptive res, to try and hit 60 FPS as a target, but it actually made no difference. In fact, in some instances it made it worse depending on where I was on the map. I've chosen Forza Horizon 4 next because I've been playing this a lot more than Forza Horizon 5 lately. I believe this gets delisted in December of 2024, so I purchased it on Steam while I could. Anyway, it should run better than Forza Horizon 5 as well. And here at 720p with the very low preset, we did just manage to hit at least 30 FPS, 37 to be precise. The 1% low did fall slightly below 30, it came in at 29, and the 0.1% figure was 27, so not perfect, but it was a pretty consistent experience, so I'll give that to the card, and for £2, I can't complain too much. One game that does a lot better than 37 FPS is Counter-Strike 2, which at 720p with the lowest settings hit 55 FPS overall. The 1% low was 38 frames per second, and as you can see from our 0.1% figure of 5, there were a few little bumps along the way. It wasn't perfect, and the biggest of the inconsistencies came when I got wiped out by other players, which happened a lot, as you've probably seen not only in this footage but in other footage of me benchmarking this online multiplayer game. Now we move on to a title which couldn't quite hit 30 FPS now. This is where the card is starting to show not only its age but its incapability, if that's even a word. 28 frames per second at the lowest 1024 by 768 resolution. The game is looking pretty bad, if I'm being completely honest, and I'm sure you'll agree. At the lowest of the low settings then, 28 FPS overall, our percentile numbers were starting to fall apart a bit here, with 12 FPS and 7 respectively for that 1 and 0.1% figure. Venturing too far into the city or any crowded areas, I mean, that would send the frame rate absolutely tanking. So overall it was less than 30, but there will be some areas that do hit at least this. Not a pleasant experience on the eyeballs though, I must say. Baldur's Gate 3 performed quite closely to The Witcher 3 in terms of an average, albeit it did look a lot worse because of the FSR 1.0 implementation that, well, I had to implement. 720p with the lowest settings here, FSR 1.0 performance mode for an average of 26. The 1% low came in at 8. And when we round that 0.1% figure up as well, which was 7.7, this was basically 8 as well. So, I mean, it wasn't perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but 26 FPS overall is actually 25 FPS more than I expected to get. And it's worth mentioning that all the games I tried to play today did actually run, apart from 2. This was Starfield, and the other one was Elden Ring, which did show me the splash screen to load, and then it just crashed or closed, so that wasn't happening either. Moving on, and next we have Minecraft. No problems here. We were actually able to bump up the resolution to 1080p, so at this point in the video your eyeballs have earned a well-deserved rest, and you can relax knowing that you're staring at 1920 by 1080 resolution now. Default fancy graphics here weren't problematic either for 138 FPS. If we disable a few extra effects and turn the render scale, or the render distance, down a little bit, then our frame rate will boost to way over 200 FPS, and the percentile lows, which were 67 and 32, will be improved as well by reducing some of those other advanced options. But here, well, I thought this was more than playable, to be honest. Grand Theft Auto 5 also ran at 1080p with the lowest settings. We did have to drop the resolution scale a little bit to 75%. I felt that this was better than turning the native res down to 720p. It certainly looked a little better in my opinion, and it ran fine with 53 frames per second. So for £2 and a card that can run GTA 5, I think you could do a lot worse than the R9 255. Now this isn't, of course, the price that most of you will be able to find it at, but there are some bargains hidden out there, especially with older and so-called obsolete hardware. Red Dead Redemption 2 now trying its best at 720p with the lowest settings. 50% resolution scale made this look like a blurry Vaseline covered mess. 29 FPS here with a 1% low of 23 and a 0.1% low of 15. Now this did do better than I thought. We could up the resolution and a few of the settings manually because we're locked out from doing it within the menu due to the VRAM limitation, but we wouldn't really want to turn things up because it's going to be absolutely detrimental to performance. I'm wondering if I'd rather sacrifice a few frames per second and bump up the res scale slightly, but to be fair, it's not going to be playable either way. It could either be a bit sharper and slightly more terrible, or you could play it like this, and yeah, that's not an easy decision to make. It was pretty bad either way. Not as bad, however, as Cyberpunk 2077, 720p here with the lowest settings. We didn't stop there though, because we also implemented FSR 2.1 and set it to the most intensive mode, which of course is ultra performance, so we're running internally probably at about 240p, something like that, for 19 FPS. And considering that this 19 FPS was only about 4 FPS higher than running at native 720p, I did wonder whether or not it was worth turning on at all. I didn't expect any better, but I wanted to test 20 of my favourite games, and this just so happened to be in the list, so there we are, worth trying nonetheless, because until you try it you don't know for sure, of course, and now that I know, I will be keeping this card away from Cyberpunk at all costs. So Fortnite up next, and 1080p with performance mode enabled. This is ideal for lower end and weaker systems. The lowest settings here, as well as 80% resolution scale, gave us a 78 FPS average. There were some problems with the percentile numbers, which were 23 and 5 respectively, but overall this was a pretty decent time. It's not all that sharp as you can imagine, but this was doable and certainly somewhat enjoyable. Battlefield 5 was also surprisingly enjoyable at the lowest settings with 50% res scale. Now I could turn this down a little bit more. I think it goes down to like 25%, but at this point, I mean, you're just going to be looking at a selection of identical looking pixels. It's not going to be ideal for the online fast-paced action that Battlefield 5 presents. So at 1080p with the lowest settings, I stuck with 50% res scale for an average of 41, which, to be fair, was playable considering the hardware. I mean, I could put up with it. My eyeballs weren't straining too much. It was actually pretty decent in my opinion. When the weather in the map got a bit better, things became a little easier to see as well. Didn't help me improve my gameplay by any means, but it certainly helped visibility somewhat. Skyrim next, this is the OG release, the original game, 1080p with a low preset. Not much to say here other than it ran at 65 FPS overall with a 1% low of 37 and a 0.1% low of 26. This is possibly one of the best results of the day. Medium actually dropped things to about 40 FPS with a few more stutters, so I stuck with the low here. I couldn't resist trying Spider-Man Remastered. 800 by 600 was the resolution and the settings were at, you guessed it, their lowest. 14 was the average here and the percentile figures were 8 and 7 respectively. Now we could enable FSR3 and we could also enable FSR3 frame generation. This did not improve things, as you can imagine. In fact, no form of upscaling, even ITGI or XESS actually improved things. So yeah, this was as good as it got, which was at the native resolution to be fair, but at 800 by 600, it's not looking that great anyway, and it's not like this sacrifice meant that the game was playable, because it certainly was not. Mafia Definitive Edition up next. This is one of my all-time favourites. I love what they did with this remake. I really like the original game too. It's a shame it's not quite playable on this card, but as with a lot of other results, this was completely expected to be fair. 20 FPS was better than I thought with the lowest settings at 720p. It wasn't too bad in terms of those percentile numbers, and I'm surprised just how good this game still looks, even at its respective lowest settings. Days Gone is another great title. I remember playing this for days on the PlayStation 4 back in the day. I've said days way too many times in one sentence there, but 1080p here with the lowest settings and 30% res scale. Yeah, you can imagine how this looks. It doesn't actually look as bad on this video after rendering as it does in real life. It wasn't playable for too long under these circumstances. Nonetheless, we were able to squeeze 32 frames per second from it with a 1% low of 16 and a 0.1% low of 15. So it's not all bad news. GTA 4 is up next, 1080p with the lowest settings. Now we have to basically retain low in order to get a somewhat consistent experience. You can turn a few things up to medium, but I found that it really affected the consistency of the game. There were a lot more stutters. GTA 4 isn't the smoothest of games anyway on certain hardware. DXVK certainly helps on newer cards, of course, but here we were pretty much limited to lowest, and it was alright. To be fair, it was okay, it was playable, doesn't look great, but yeah, I certainly enjoyed myself with this one. Next up, I tried Bioshock Infinite. I loved this back in the day on the PlayStation 3, one of my all-time favourites. At 1080p with the lowest settings, it's playable with 48 FPS, and the 1% and 0.1% numbers weren't too bad either at 37 and 35. There's just something about this game that is really special to me, and if you haven't played Bioshock Infinite, please give it a go, because yeah, it's well worth it in 2024 still. I think it holds up. You can probably get it quite cheap as well, and as you can see here, it's going to run pretty well even on older hardware. Another favourite of mine is the Outer Worlds. This is the original release because it runs a lot better than the Spacer's Choice remake or remaster, whatever you want to call it, but 1080p with the lowest settings here. We did have to sacrifice that native resolution in favour of 50% 3D res, but we did squeeze at least 30 FPS from it here. 31 to be precise, so not too bad. I really like the art style of this game. It still looks good. It doesn't look too bad at 50% 3D res either. A bit blurry as you would expect, but the little R9 255 is really pushing through here and desperately trying to hang on as it squeezes 30 FPS from this game. Crysis Remastered then to finalise, and although 1080p was out of the question, 720p with the lowest settings was doable for at least 30 FPS once again. Now for £2, I'm finding it very difficult to complain. The selection of games we've tested today, some ran absolutely fine in my opinion for the money, and considering the age of this card. This was never a high-end card. I'm thinking it was probably a more sort of entry-level, or sort of between entry-level mid-range back when it came out. Could be wrong, it could be bottom of the barrel. I don't think it was. There is a DDR5 version though, which probably would have been better. I'm not sure about now, but there we go. I hope you've enjoyed my look at this car boot sale find, and making this video sort of took me back to the days of those really cheap cards we used to find, like my £1.50 graphics card from CEX as well. So I hope you've enjoyed this one. I certainly had fun making it, and as always, I look forward to seeing all of you in the next one. Thanks for watching.